My lecture is Ecopedagogy, Criticality, and Research. I'm going to talk about this title first. What does it really mean? And then go from there. Oops, for some reason. Okay, great. Okay, so the title overall, one of the key things that really discuss throughout my work is this aspect of criticality. What is that? And a lot of times, as Samson knows, as one of my previous students in Beijing, a lot of times I use the handbook from Michael Appel, Waynar, and Gardine that talks about some of the key factors of critical pedagogy, critical theories. And one of the key things, and I'm going to go through a lot of these questions throughout the lecture, and indirectly and directly. The first thing is, what is education for? And a lot of scholars talk about education, public education specifically, came out for two different reasons. One is this aspect of citizenship. How do you teach for someone to be a viable member of society, to continue traditions, cultures, and so on? But also critically, it's this aspect of how has citizenship also been a source of oppression, especially how is a non-citizen treated? A lot of times, say in the United States, people talk about this aspect of, public education was not just all for good, but also putting people in their place. For example, African Americans, Latinos, and so on, immigrants overall. And also this aspect of development, that education should be this aspect of utopia for this better society. But a lot of what I'll be problematizing in this lecture is both of these, but development first. Whose development are we going towards? How does things like globalization affect that? With histories of colonialism, histories of patriarchy, and things like racism and items like that. How do we define development? And also, how does that affect the rest of Earth, the rest of the planet? So, and going into the title a little bit further, it's this aspect of socio-environmental justice, from the self to the global. So it's this aspect, and I divide this up from planetary sustainability, because it's this aspect that us being historical, reflexive beings, being able to view histories and praxis and all these other abilities that humans have, that Paulo Freire talks about, that's where justice comes about. And this comes from a lot of ecofeminist theories, such as from Karen Warren and others, this aspect that justice has to be a reciprocal aspect. But planetary sustainability includes justice, but it's also beyond that. For example, we just had a very large hurricane here in the United States in the southeast. It isn't that nature is being unjust to us, for example. So that's some of the reasons why I divide up those two aspects in all my work. And also this aspect of the world as all of human beings and human societies, and Earth overall. And I won't go into it, but maybe a little bit later on, but this aspect that I often don't say the Earth to objectify the Earth, part of eco-linguistics, but just Earth. So it's not just because it's 4:30 in the morning here that I'm forgetting about the. So these are some of the different aspects that I'll go through throughout the lecture. I usually am overly optimistic about how much time I have and how many slides I have, but hopefully I'll go through many of these different aspects. So first, this aspect of education and sustainable development. I'm going to describe what that upper and lowercase d is. This socio-historical analysis of education and development nexuses. And we're talking about socio-historical, a lot of it is coming from this aspect of continuing socio-historical oppressions. How do they affect this aspect of how do we teach environmentalism or anti-environmentalism, unfortunately? And how do we research it, and all the other aspects of education, between structuring education and so on. And this goes into, this is only some parts of the list, but racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, neo-coloniality, globalizations. Globalizations is plural to signify this globalizations from above and from below, or the globalizers and the globalized. Aspects of citizenship, neoliberalism, northern epistemicide, and so on and so on. So one of the things that I usually begin my publications with, and also lectures, is this assumption that, when humans carry out an environmentally harmful act, these are done to benefit some individual, some population. And this population can be very, very fluid, depending on how you're defining it. Because without any conceptualized benefits, individuals would have no motive for many of the anti-environmental actions. For example, there would be no reason why we would be going to the bottom of the floor of the oceans to drill a substance, a fluid, a very viscous fluid, if there wasn't a reason for that. A lot of times, depending on where you're living, electricity, heat, computers, given this lecture right now, is this aspect of using these resources a lot of times. But the key thing with ecopedagogy is trying to teach in a way that students are able to critically read who benefits, who pays, and who suffers from human actions that are harmful to the environment. And if it gets very complex, for many different reasons that I'll talk about. And one of them is one of these notations. Both of them are. One is that a lot of times we don't realize what are going to be the negative aspects. We build a dam for water supply, but we don't know all of the aspects that it's going to affect the ecology and human society along with that. The second one is that it's a continuum of actions. So environmental violence is a continuum of actions. Michael Apple talks about this. He talked about it at Beijing Normal University and other places, this aspect that, me being here doing this lecture, recognizing that using electricity, recognizing that that's usually a form of environmental violence, where it's energy coming from, recognizing the labor issues, the labor justice issues, the economic justice issues, aspects like that in all of the ways that we use natural resources, for example. So turning on a light switch to something like mountaintop removal. This aspect that it's a continuum of environmental violence. And the question is, what is that sustainability, that balance between being able to use resources and using alternative resources, the politics of using what resources, and how can we teach towards that? And research on trying to figure out, how do we teach in such a way that it can be environmental or anti-environmental? And a lot of times it's this aspect of, a lot of times it's done subconsciously also. How we teach, the language that we use, and aspects like that I'm going to discuss throughout this lecture. So going into environmental pedagogies, and I use the umbrella term environmental pedagogies because there's many different models. There's environmental education, education for sustainable development, ecopedagogy, and many more throughout the world. When environmental education came out, and this is contextually, especially coming from the West, a lot of times environmental education was seen as conservation-based. It was seen not linked to social issues and social justice issues. It marginalized a lot of times along the lines of racism and other aspects. It's a lot of times in the West seen as something that was for middle to upper class white population. Urban environmental issues were not addressed, and a lot of times it was seen as not as practical enough. And I specified at the beginning Western context, because it depends on where you are in the world. For example, a lot of my research that has been done in Brazil and Argentina and Latin America Environmental education is very much opposite of this in many different ways. It's very much more connected to social justice issues, fighting against social injustices and oppressions and things like that, more so than when it began in environmental education in the West, I would say, especially in the United States. So a lot of times this aspect went over to education for sustainable development, but that doesn't mean that, environmental education is no longer, very important. There's a lot of importance with both of them. So environmental pedagogies, when I ever use that term, it's more this umbrella term and things like that, because a lot of people see these different pedagogical models as interchangeable with the terminology. Even myself, I'm doing a encyclopedia of environmental education and using it, environmental education, because it's a very well-known term. So this aspect of development, when we talk about ESD, development for who? And I use upper and lowercase lettering, and I'll show this more specifically as more lowercase d, as more aspects of for planetary sustainability, incorporating epistemologies of the South and indigenous knowledges and pedagogies and so on and so on. Uppercase D is this aspect that it's this dominant model of development, say this aspect of Western development for all of the world, that that everyone should be contributing to Western models of development, for example. I'm going to discuss that more as the time goes on. So how is development framed, and who defines development? And this goes back to Mike's and Wayne's and Gardine's questions that came from their handbook. Who defines official knowledge? Who defines development, and why? And how does things like globalization and histories of repressions affect this? This aspect of development, is it overly focused on economics overall? And if it is, what models of economics? Are we talking about neoliberalism or models going towards economic justice, for example? And how can sustainability be taught if the economic models themselves, and if development is based on that, how can it be any sort of goals of justice, of equality? What are the effects of globalizations? Is models of development more homogeneous or heterogeneous now? And this is coming from, this aspect of globalization from above, globalization from below. And how can this aspect, if going towards only models of, say, capitalism, or especially with neoliberalism, how can sustainability ever be an endpoint if there's a constant aspect of consumption, increasing the profits, increasing the consumption, as we see ourselves as development? And I think Samson, being a previous student of mine, I really try each time when I say development, saying economic development, for example, because there's many ways that people develop culturally, socially, linguistically, and so on and so on. So this aspect of uppercase and lowercase d with development, this is coming from work from, say, Sandra Harding's work on environmental education and feminism, for example. Standpoint theory, a lot of her work is this uppercase and lowercase s, when she questions, is science neutral? And her answer, obviously, much like Paulo Freire's, is no. But it's this aspect of uppercase S in sciences signifying dominant sciences, Western sciences, things like that, compared to lowercase s, talking about indigenous, Southern sciences, and so on and so on. So this aspect of uppercase D is this aspect that neoliberalism guides development, that it deprioritizes justice labor, labor justice, economic justice, and so on, more for profit, for few. Deprioritizes planetary sustainability, separates it from injustices and oppressions. It's guided by globalization from above. And these are just some examples. The development with a lowercase d is more that it's guided by globally all-inclusive social justice based within planetary sustainability. And that's a phrase that I use a lot of times, this aspect of all-inclusive social justice and planetary sustainability. That should be the utopian goal, that this aspect of how can we have education and research going towards this aspect of globally inclusive socio-environmental justice. And that socio-environmental is this recognition that environmental violence and social violence cannot be separated. They're inseparable. But a lot of times how it's taught for various political reasons is that it's seen as separate. Well, you know, you hear a lot, even with, well, especially in public pedagogy, you know, politicians, I could say Donald Trump, probably daily or hourly, this aspect separating, you know, environmental violence. Well, we can't focus on environmental issues because the economics is so important and things like that. And this teaching of how do we teach development in formal education, but also how is it perceived in society overall, in informal education, in public pedagogy, in movies, and, you know, social media, the internet, and so on and so on. Prioritizes justice-based economics, labor, and so on and so on. That this aspect that development should be grounded upon the aspect of sustainability. And this aspect of locally constructed with global and planetary understandings, which I'll explain in a few slides. So that ultimate goal, once again, is this aspect that how can we teach in such a way that development, that it's saturated with this aspect of sustainability, that, you know, that sustainability doesn't even have to be part of the discussions, or even part of the term. And neoliberalism, for example, you know, there's many different ways that I'll go into where that's one of the most devastating things, especially connected with globalization from above, global neoliberalism. Leopold, in one of his famous articles on environmental education, we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity. And it's this aspect of how can we teach in such a way that the world of humans and human societies is seen as part of the rest of nature, and the nature is just not separate from this. There's a lot of educators, obviously, that have discussed this. One of the key ones, too, is Ivan Ilyich in his book, Deschooling Society. Its last chapter, chapter 7, really talks about this aspect of how has society seen modernization as separating themselves from the rest of nature. And a lot of my work problematizes, along with aspects of development, how do we teach what is modernization, what is modernities, and aspects like that. And a lot of the wording, I'm going to skip over. I'm going to come back to this aspect of development with the Lord D teaching it. So neoliberalism, as everyone knows, this aspect of, it's very complicated, but very simplified. So everyone's on the same page that everything is going towards economic profit, environmentalism, say health, education, sciences, knowledges, global positioning, and this aspect of individualism, extreme individualism compared to collectivism. And this idea that Dirk Postma has in his book, Why Care for Nature, this aspect of how does neoliberalism affect society between the private and public sphere? That neoliberalism values everything that's individual and devalues everything that's within society as a whole. That that all that matters is how do I profit within my private sphere. And I only care about the public sphere as how it positively or negatively affects my profiting within the private sphere. And that there's no way that environmentalism or aspects of, say, peace education or these larger issues can be successful if we devalue what's happening in the private sphere, for example. And I go a little bit crazy in one of my articles that are listed above, how I expand on this notion and stuff like that. But the main aspect is this aspect of how can we teach in such a way that we value each other, and that we have education for practice towards ending oppressions, unsustainability, environmental violence, all these different aspects globally in a collective aspect, but also through local knowledges, perspectives, this aspect of deepening and widening that I'll talk about in just, I think probably the next slide or so. So one of the key aspects this comes down to is that a lot of times this aspect that, how do we teach in indirect ways, a lot of times that, environmental well-being means that livelihood is devalued. Ecopedagogy is that, they're both very much related, to say the least. A lot of this comes down to, what do we define as livelihood? How do we value or devalue others' livelihoods or lifestyle? And lifestyle can be very much problematized, especially in the global South, in that this argument that that's very much of a Western term, to say the least. And also, how can we have this aspect of these larger goals of, say, the Sustainable Development Goals? How are all these 16 interrelated with one another? And I say 16 because the 17th one, it's more this aspect of partnerships towards achieving these goals. But that not achieving one of them means that we won't achieve any of them. And this is a lot of my arguments when I reviewed part of the this UNESCO document for education for SDGs, the learning objectives. How does all these goals all related? But also, what is the language that is used within, say, the guidebook, within UNESCO and others, that, that it's, what are the politics of what is being focused upon and what is not being focused upon when we're going towards achieving these goals for the SDGs beyond number 4. And one of the key things with sustainability too is this aspect of, what is a baseline? Or what is the level of sustainability? Where do we position, what is the goal of sustainability? Is it what is happening right now at this very minute, that everything should stay equal as it is currently? But if it is that, it means that all the oppressions, all the socio-environmental oppressions that are happening today continues. So one of the key aspects is, how do we teach for questioning, reflexivity on what are we going towards? What is a sustainability goal? And trying to think of it as, say, also teaching in such a way that aligning with Bonaventura de Sousa Santos' argument that reflection is meaningless if we're using the same grounding epistemologies that has that justifies oppressions and anti-environmentalism as its epistemological foundations. How can we look beyond that? How can we have ecologies of knowledges? As Santos talks about, that epistemologies of the North are grounded in coloniality, patriarchy, and capitalism. So when we talk about these issues of education for environmentalism, critical environmentalism, it's this questioning of, how can we teach in a reflexivity, critically reading, that is beyond, the groundings that is pushed a lot of times, Western, Northern epistemologies, especially with globalization from above. So discussing eco-pedagogy, what is it overall, specifically? Eco-pedagogy comes from, or is grounded in, the work of Paulo Freire, um, um, from Brazil. I could talk a lot about Paulo Freire. It was just his 100th birthday, if he was alive, just a year ago. And his most famous book is Pedagogy of the Press, and he's written many books, to say the least. And his next chapter, his next publication, was actually supposed to be on eco-pedagogy. Some of the passages that he was working on actually ended up being in pedagogy of indignation. Sorry, it's too early to pronounce every word correctly. I apologize for that. But this last work of his, or one of his last works, but this was actually published after his death, with a lot of his work that he was writing. And actually, as I found out from one of his former students and the director of the Paulo Freire Institute in Sao Paulo, Mr. Godotti, he had a lot of the writings on his desk that he was working on was on eco-pedagogy, and a lot of it ended up in this book. And one thing that myself and Carlos Alberto Torres wrote is this missing chapter of Pedagogy of the Press. Freire talked about that, that a chapter was missing in his book. That would have been a 5th chapter of his book on eco-pedagogy. And what we try to do very humbly was trying to write in what he might have written if he was alive today on it. And that we wrote it in such a way that Paulo Freire very much rewrote a lot of his book and added chapter 4, but mostly rewrote a lot of his book after reading Frantz Fanon's work and Albert Memmi's work on coloniality. We wrote it in that sort of way. So on eco-pedagogy, there's a few books on eco-pedagogy. The first one is this one to the left by Francisco Gutierrez and Cruz Prado, that came out in 1989 originally, the first version of it. And there's many others from Mr. Godotti, who's probably the most well-known person that focuses on eco-pedagogy, and one of the most famous people on Freire, and people also like Richard Kahn. And also there's a lot of new books coming out, such as post-digital eco-pedagogies. I have a chapter on this aspect of how can Freire be reinvented and eco-pedagogy be reinvented within the post-digital world, and how we're inseparable from digital technologies and so on. There's also various books that I've written, some that Samson has already talked about, and also this one that's coming out, Freudian Environmentalism, hopefully in a couple months. So this aspect of eco-pedagogy, to define it a little bit more, it's this aspect that environmental violence and social violence is inseparable. And questioning what are the politics of separating environmental violence and social violence? How is that taught? How is that not taught? And most importantly, what are the politics behind it not being taught or mistaught? And also this larger aspect of how is teaching being done subconsciously that separates environmental violence and social violence in different ways. And talking about the world, once again, as humans and all human societies, or as an anthroposphere. And this comes from Paulo Freire's work when, I believe it was Pedagogy of Freedom, where he asked a peasant in Brazil, would there be a world without humans? And the peasant said that it's impossible because it's the human interactions that we have with one another that makes up the world and things like that. So we divided up this aspect of Earth and the rest of the world as separate from the rest of Earth for various reasons that I'll get into. And once again, education means, when we're talking about it, not just formal education, but non-formal and informal or public pedagogy, including say, internet and social media. And this aspect of how do we expand this on the planetary violence, planetary sphere, and that also that social violence, when we talk about the world, it's only part of the overall biological Earth overall, and that we're one of many species, but we're also the source of imbalance. We're the source of unsustainability. Where the rest of Earth goes towards equilibrium, we're the source that's the source of unsustainability because of our reflexivity, because of our aspects of, being able to reflect and act upon our reflections, our histories, our dreams, and so on and so on. CERII in Pedagogy of the Press said that we're the only beings that have these abilities, but there's also this aspect of responsibility. So this aspect that the rest of Earth is going towards this equilibrium that's, say, going, that's aligning with the laws of nature, that's static. We're the only beings that are subjective, or at least subjective, historical, being able to reflect upon our histories, our cultures, and so on and so on. So this aspect that, there might be a lot of violence coming from, say, a hurricane, but it's this equilibrium between two air pressure systems that are trying to equal out because of the cause of the hurricane. So the question is, what is this balance between us making up the world and the rest of the planet? And this aspect of shallow and deep environmental pedagogies. For example, shallow ones focus only on economics, especially neoliberalism. They separate sciences and technologies from humanization. They call for environmentalism or sustainability, but without transformative possibilities of all aspects of society. This aspect will, that we have to go towards sustainability, but the political, the economic, the social systems have to remain the same. Where deep models, including ecopedagogy, is transdisciplinary, critical, looking at the local to the global and also to the planetary, problem posing, that's aligned very much with CERII's pedagogy. This aspect of transformability of all aspects of society's structures. Now, some people talk about, well, CERII, how should I say this? CERII talks about that CERII is trying to transform all parts of society and things like that. There's a few people that disregard what CERII says about this. And also, they also talk about how CERII might be anti-environmental because he differentiates human beings from the rest of all of the beings on Earth. But CERII is very much talking about this aspect that there has to be transformation, but it's within respecting and understanding contextually cultural traditions, languages, and so on and so on. And it's very much against cultural invasion. So a lot of my writings, along with Mike Apple's and others, talk about how a lot of people misread or shallowly read Pedagogy of the Press, or they only read Pedagogy of the Press. And that's the same thing with people saying that the differentiation of how CERII talks about human beings, and others too, say John Dewey and others, as compared to the rest of animals or living beings on Earth. It wasn't that he was devaluing all others. It's more calling out the responsibility. And he talks about this in his ecopedagogical readings, but also his readings in his later works, such as Pedagogy of the Heart, Pedagogy of Freedom, Pedagogy of Hope, and so on and so on. It's also planetary. It's all of Earth, not just human beings. So it's beyond the anthroposphere. And also this aspect of centering hope. very much is against this aspect that, there should be only one future, for example. There's a lot of discussions, especially with UNESCO and others, talking about futures education. That Freire was very much against, wanted to counter, education that only had one possible future, this aspect of fatalism. And for true transformation is this aspect that we must be going towards this hope. Freire talks about, if there's anything that education should do, education should be structured in such a way that that students are able to dream of possible utopias and reflexivity on actions that they can take going towards those utopias. But much of education isn't. And it's this aspect that I talk about is deepening and widening understandings or readings, bottom-up teaching and research. What is the local impact when we're talking about deepening? Using local, indigenous, Southern sciences and knowledges, and also aspects of citizenship should be local to national to global, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Also, a widening perspective. How do we look at local issues in the global and planetary aspects? That it's through multiple sciences and knowledges. That it isn't so much that giving up, Western sciences or epistemologies of the North, but it's this aspect of how can we use them all together. Boaventura de Sousa Santos talks about how epistemologies of the South isn't that Southern epistemologies are going to become dominant, switching places with Northern epistemologies, but it's this aspect of having ecologies of knowledges, and that the role of epistemologies of the South is to counter the oppressive aspects of epistemologies of the North, and also going to go into citizenships. So I think most of you know some of Paulo Freire's work, this aspect that, that it's not just instructor telling the students what to think and how to think, this aspect of banking education, but it's this, that students and teachers are both students and teachers together, democratic, dialogical reading. That it's holistic analysis. It's important what happens inside the classroom, but what's equally as important is what happens outside the classroom. And it's also this aspect of utopia. This aspect of how can we teach in such a way that students have the ability of dreaming of possible futures, of ending oppression, of bettering the world. And this comes from Freire's work, but also Godotti's analysis on Freire's work, this aspect of, when we talk about teaching through generative themes of meanings, of commonalities of meanings, it's this aspect of trying to teach or understand between teachers and students what is actually happening, what is possible, and what are the limit situations between, or those gaps between what's actually occurring and what should be occurring. And Freire talks about this as limit situation. And for this to work, there has to be this aspect of utopia in education, this aspect of hope. And utopianism is actually, a lot of times people say, well, that's, fanciful learning or thinking and things like that. Freire and others very much talk about how this aspect of utopia is very much also grounded in realities. It isn't that, that it's going to be easy to achieve, or even that utopia is achievable. Many talk about utopia as this aspect of, say, the North Star or horizon that you can never reach. But it's this aspect that, and a lot of people talk about, when I ask my students, and Samson might remember this aspect when I ask students, what about the SDGs from UNESCO in 2035 or for 2030 for some of them? Are they going to be achieved? Are we going to have, complete success, or are there going to be another set of goals that are going to be another name other than the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Goals, or so on and so on? But a lot of people discuss how those goals of this aspect of unachievable aspects to go towards rather than achieving them, but hopefully they'll be achieved in many ways. So this is eco-pedagogical literacy. And I talk about how this should be the foundational aspect of what is a goal for environmental pedagogies. This aspect to, well, Ferry talked about that we should teach the word to teach students to read the word, to read the world. And eco-pedagogy is to teach to read the word, to read the world as part of Earth, this aspect that teaching towards this larger aspect of how not only what's happening in the world, but also what's happening planetary wise. And that very, very much also is this bottom-up approach, that teaching should be trying to better understand oppression from those who struggle most from those oppressions. How can we understand oppressions the best, and who knows best on how to end oppressions are those who are suffering from oppressions. And once again, I won't go into it, but it isn't this aspect that there's one group of oppressors and one group of the oppressed. But Ferry talks about that everyone is both oppressed and is an oppressor. So it's a very relational term. But it's this aspect of when we're trying to understand, you know, how does climate change affect the world's populations, really trying to understand it from perspective from those who are suffering most from global climate change or will be suffering. And I'll give some examples of that in a few slides. So it's this aspect of you have the world and the earth, and you know, this aspect of, I talk about it in distancing. How does education distance us from the rest of earth? And how can we have teaching? How can we have research that de-distances that? And it's this aspect too, this understanding that, you know, earth, the rest of earth is this aspect of being static more, going through the laws of nature, compared to, say, subjectivity. This aspect of being able to be transformable of the world making up humans, and those contradictions and things like that. And no matter, we've seen this COVID-19, I've written about quite extensively on how hopefully it has shown us that no matter how much we say that, you know, a virus isn't going to affect the rest of the world, after, you know, 7 million plus people have unfortunately passed away with it, no matter how much we teach that, you know, it doesn't matter. And I often tell my students, no matter how much Trump has said, especially when it first occurred, that's no big problem, it still affects us no matter what we say or not. So it's this realization on how the politics of education has separated us from the rest of Earth. Ivan Illich talks about this in his book, Deschooling Society, as, you know, how has modern men, unfortunately he's gendered the word, but unfortunately historically usually it has been men, how have they been different from the past, where people thought that they were that they were doing something that tempt nature, but they knew that there were consequences. But now in society, we think that we can do whatever we want, and all of our wishes and wants will be fulfilled because we have to dominate nature. And we see with the pandemic or natural disasters, climate change, that no matter what happens, you know, it's also this aspect that trying to, you know, what is the end points, the oppressions, the devastation that will come about if we just think about our actions within, say, a neoliberalism compared to sustainability, especially in the planetary aspect. How a lot of times do we distance each other in different ways? Say in othering, you know, well, you know, environmental oppressions are happening, but it's not happening to us, it's happening to them. How do we other the them? How do we do it by geographically? This aspect, well, it's not affecting us here, but it's happening over there. How does, say, the United States and companies, export environmental oppressions? Epistemologically, how do we use certain epistemologies, ways of thinking, either consciously or subconsciously, to justify environmental unsustainability, injustices, time-wise? Well, that is going to be a problem, but it's going to be a problem in many, many years from now. And a lot of times we're off by how long it's going to take to really feel the negative aspects. We see that in climate change and extreme weather. Language and linguistics, for example, objectifying Earth as the Earth. So how can we teach to de-distance the rest of Earth and us making up the world? And how do we use different epistemologies, with upper and lowercase lettering of development, knowledges, sciences, technologies, sustainability, and so on and so on. And this last one is probably one of the, this is just one last example, this aspect of farming, industrial farming compared to other ways of farming, for example. And so the key thing with a lot of my research is that education shouldn't be this aspect of acquiring knowledge. It's very much aligned with critical pedagogy, that it shouldn't be just, how much knowledge can we fit into, deposit in students' brains, but how can we teach in such a way that, for critical literacy, ecopedagogical literacy, that it ends this aspect towards or an endpoints of praxis for environmentalism, sustainability, socio-environmental justice, peace, and so on and so on. So a lot of times this aspect of how can we problematize development? How can we problematize things like livelihood between, the private and public sphere, local, national, global, with or without sustainability? How can we teach in such a way that students can understand, even within their daily lives, on how their actions might affect others, and especially around the world, especially when we think about where are we mining resources to make products like our phones, or the labor issues and things like that. What kind of environment, what sources of energy do we use or not use, and what are the politics behind that? What about contextuality of environmental violence? This is Beijing has become much more less polluted since I got there in 2013. But this was a picture, I think, from a faculty meeting in 2015. When it's a bad, I always give this example, and I think in some of my books I've given this example. As a professor in Beijing, if it's a bad pollution day, yes, it affects me also. Air. No matter, we can't get away from it. But how does it affect me as a professor compared to, say, people who are working on the street, in construction, in food services, in cleaning, and things like that, who are outside, 8, 12, 16 plus hours, and things like that? What are the differences between, myself, who can afford, air filtration systems and can work from home usually if I'm not teaching, if it's a really bad pollution day, and things like that, compared to people who are making a living being outside, and trying to understand that not just locally but also globally? How this aspect of by 2050 between 25 million and 1 billion people will be forced to migrate because of climate change. Well, who will that affect most? And some of the factors that the IOM talks about is, climate change scenarios, what will happen, adaptation actions, how will we try to prevent it? But also the third one is very much aligned, all these are aligned with ecopedagogy, but the third one is these critical issues of what about the socioeconomics, the politics, the democratic factors of what happens with climate change and who does it affect and who does it not affect. Reading development, myself, I probably have, I think, probably 4 or 5 different items right on my table right here with little apples on them, little Apple logos. But, what are the labor issues? What are the environmental issues? A lot of people talk about that something like the iPhone should be 10 times more expensive because of all the social justice issues, the environmental issues that we export. When I was an environmental studies student back in the early 90s, I read a lot about how every McDonald's hamburger was $300 or should be $300. And I think at the time it's 99 cents. Why is that? It's because of the desertification that will happen, and transportation issues, and labor issues. And McDonald's at the time was getting a lot of that beef from Latin America also. How do we export that? How do we, meaning myself as a Westerner, very much benefit from others' oppressions? And what are those complex issues? And how can we begin to teach students to read that? And how can we have research that really delves into what are the deeper issues of education, of students being able to understand what are the connections between social and environmental violence and labor issues, economic issues, and things like, STEM subjects. STEM subjects are very important. But how do we a lot of times overvalue STEM subjects and devalue the humanities and social sciences disciplines? Or a lot of times people talk about STEAM, but like what Michael Apple talks about, is that art is very important within STEM, but it's also important outside of STEM. It shouldn't just be located so we can, increase, sciences and technologies, engineering and mathematics. And, why does environmental pedagogies fail a lot of times? I discuss that a lot of times it's taught as apolitical. That this is how the world is, and this is how the world always will be. And that it's ahistorical and acultural. We don't understand, what are the aspects of de-development on many parts of the world, especially the global south, due to histories of coloniality, for example, which continues, unfortunately, a lot of times with processes of globalizations. How does environmental issues continue a lot of times? Because of histories of coloniality, of getting resources, of labor, and exporting environmental issues to other parts of the world, for example, and cultural. This aspect that, if we have one successful pedagogical model, well, we're just going to keep on cutting and pasting it or cookie cutting it all parts of the world. And that almost never works. I would say that never works, but maybe someone can bring up a case that it does. We can contextually lend and borrow through comparative education methods and things like that, but it has to be locally contextual, including ecopedagogy, having aspects of foundations of what is the overall goals and some of the techniques of teaching, but it has to be reinvented. That was one of the key things that Freire talked about, reinvention of his scholarship and other scholarships. And don't have enough time to go into it, but there's a lot of discussions that can be had with, say, cheap nature notions from Jason Moore, or acceleration of Western modernity by Hermann Rosa. And also this aspect of post-truthism. How can we teach in such a way that students are able to critically read what are truths? And obviously with critical pedagogy, and even more so with postmodernism and things like that, this aspect of subjectivity is always there. What are truths? Things like that. Hayden White, you could go into an extreme with that. All history is fiction. But how can we teach in such a way that, that what is being said, especially on the internet, that isn't even trying to go towards the truth? And I've written some on this. especially when we're talking about climate change denials. I think I have probably 3 more minutes. I have about maybe 50 more slides, but I'll try to end it rather quickly within 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll give you 5 minutes, Greg. So
5 minutes? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to go. I talk too much, and I am always over optimistic about how much time I have. But some of the research just want to go into, it's this aspect of, this is a chapter that I wrote on the right side, one of my publications on, comparative and international education. It's this aspect of how can we teach, how can we use research to truly examine, well, that first sentence, examine how environmental pedagogies teach how socio-historical oppressions falsely justify environmentally violent, unsustainable acts in the name of development. Within education, including within environmental education or environmental pedagogies. Going back to this aspect of how can we make sure that less environmental pedagogies fail, meaning that our actual practice that is coming out of students, but also, the conundrum of that criticality and critical pedagogy is not telling students what to think or how to think, but at least giving them the tools to be able to critically read, to have them critically reflect upon, what is true and what is not true. How does my actions, how does this action from my government or this company affect, societies, not just locally, but globally or nationally. So going through this aspect of histories of oppressions, and there's also recognition that, comparative education, when we compare and contrast educational systems, either, especially internationally, not all comparative education was justice-based, especially when it's that, especially initially, when it was mostly, how does it compare to the best system that's coming from the United States or the UK? That's a horrible way of doing any comparative studies. Benchmarking will, that this aspect that, all of the educational systems are deficient. But unfortunately, especially in the past, but unfortunately continuing, that's how a lot of comparative education happens, comparative education research. So this is from Phillips and Sweisford, their book, this aspect that, that comparative education, country A is not doing so well, country B is doing well economically. So, you just put in country B's to country A's and everything's going to be wonderful. And that almost never works. How can we contextually lend and borrow from each other, understand positive and negative aspects contextually? This aspect that, this is a graphic from Mark Bray and Thomas from 1995. This aspect of how research is done. They talk about comparative education, but this is basically, that how all research is done. A lot of times, you can't research everything, so you're going into smaller and smaller aspects, which is very needed. But it's also this realization that, all these different aspects are very much connected. And I would say how I would change this model is that there's also a planetary aspect, planetary sphere of it. And also this aspect of needing limitations of research, that realizing that, what we know, but also realizing what we don't know. And those should be continued questions, research questions, going towards what do I not know? And this aspect of positionalities, for example, using feminist standpoint theory, this aspect that, truly, that I can try to begin to understand how environmentalism or anti-environmentalism affects a community, but unless I'm part of that community, I really won't fully understand it. But the goal is to understand it more and more with participants and who is involved within research. And I think I'm going to end here, even though I have a lot more. I wish I had another couple hours, but you know, this one aspect that Nidri, Asi Lubumba, talks about. Nidri, in her presidential speech on comparative education, talks about these aspects of how what frameworks, what methodologies do we see as good and bad, and why? Questioning, what are we comparing? What are the assumptions on when we compare? What about the nation state as a key in defining the unit of analysis? Roger Dale has a wonderful article talking about, you know, comparative education is very much limited a lot of times because we still use the nation state or the city state and others as the sole aspect of comparing, where, you know, it should be more this aspect of governance. What is the future that we aim to build? You know, a lot of research has seen us, you know, it's very much, you know, that I'm just observing what's happening and things like that. But there's always this politics of what are we trying, what are the goals of education? And I would go back to this aspect of, you know, how do we define development? How do we define, you know, a better world, a sustainable earth? Who's involved with that? When we talk about, you know, wanting a better world, you know, in citizenship, who are our fellow citizens? Do we see it as a local aspect, or a traditional national citizenship, or a global or planetary citizenship? And global citizenship, I was going to explain later on, is, you know, a contested training of all of itself also. What paradigms guide us? Who has the agency and legitimacy to define the methodologies? What methodologies are used and not used? And who do we see as legitimate of using them? And what are the units of analysis that we use? And using, you know, aspects of Southern theory and critical race theories and critical eco-racism theories and feminist theories and so on to try to understand how can we use research going towards socio-environmental violence, planetary sustainability, and things like that throughout all of our work. So I'll end it there.